recovered.
Hey, before we get going, may I ask you, do you have a copy of the book handy? Because once I start, I'm going to ask you to hold it up and read the title because I did mine on Kindle.
Okay.
And so I could pull quotes that I want to talk about and read, do my thing with it. But usually I dog ear the book and hold it up so the author can see the pages all marked so they know I actually did it. Yours, you're going to have to take my word, but I will be quoting from the book quite a lot. So you'll know that I actually read it.
Oh,
And
I'm honored. Thank you.
oh, it's not an honor. And a big shout out to Melanie Brooks, who recommended you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to introduce you properly, because I think we're doing our thing. We're recording, we're on YouTube, and we're doing all that stuff. So my name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Laura Carney. And Laura Carney is a writer and a copy editor in New York. And a friend of ours, a mutual friend, Melanie Brooks, who is another author we interviewed fairly recently, recommended you, Laura. And your work as a copy editor has been primarily in magazines for 20 years, including Good Housekeeping, People, Guidepost, Vanity Fair, and GQ. You are, or she is, or Laura is, however you want
What
to.
am I?
Yeah, the author of My Father's List, How Living My Dad's Dream Set Me Free, published by Post Hill Press in June 2023. And this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. As I said, please subscribe to it on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack commentary page, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And again, a big thank you to Melanie for sending you our way. So first off, will you just hold that book up, as I mentioned a minute ago, because I read mine on Kindle. Hold it up and tell me the title.
The title is My Father's List, How Living My Dad's Dreams Set Me Free. I'm trying to do like a Vanna White.
Yeah, there you are. And I'm going to ask you to do that a couple of times. So keep it handy. I'm going to start this. I have a bunch of quotes from your book here, and I want to begin by doing something that you do right at the end of the book. And you talk about the list that your dad left a kind of a bucket list before he was killed in an accident. And I thought I would just read the list. It's a little long, but if you want to turn to the page, you know where I'm talking about toward the end of your book. I forget it's
Yeah.
on pages 292 to 295. Rather than me reading this, it begins live a long, healthy life, at least to the year 2020. Would you mind reading this whole numbered list? And then that sort of sets up what you set out to do to fulfill most of the things on his list he had not done. I think you said he had achieved six. Is that correct?
Yeah, achieved five, marked one as having failed.
Yeah, he achieved five things out of a list. Just give me the number again. How
Uh,
many things?
54 was how many I did. He had
Yeah,
achieved five himself, and he had
yeah.
marked one as having failed that could never be done.
Okay, so I'll set this up one more time. This book, it's a very interesting premise. It's the bucket list of a father who died in an accident, tragically young compared to what he could have lived. Um, and his daughter, who I'm talking today, Laura, found a list of things he would like to do that he had written when he was much younger. How old was he when he wrote out the list of what he wanted to do?
He was 29. It was the year I was born.
And he was killed at what age?
54, oddly.
Okay.
I ended up
So
doing 54 list items, Frank. Isn't that a
yeah,
weird
so
coincidence?
basically, you found a list of a young man saying, here's what I'd like to do with my life before it's over. And it was cut short, and he didn't get to do the list and might not have been able to. And you're a well-traveled person and have done amazing things. And it includes everything from, Vienna to whatever. And we'll go through the whole list. So let's start by you reading his list of things he wanted to do, which you, his daughter, some 20 years later, I'm bad at math, so if that's not right,
Just
close
about.
enough.
We found the list 13 years after he died.
Yeah, and before you start, I just want to say one thing. I am a father and grandfather. And one of the reasons your book touched me, besides the fact that it's beautifully written and you really have writer's chops,
Thank you.
is, yeah, I really mean that. It's lovely. It pulled me right in. Um, I was so touched as a 72-year-old male who just had a bunch of melanoma cut off my head that you are the kind of daughter to a man that every father would wish for, because you did a big piece of living for him. And I think it's such a gift and such a beautiful way to remember someone. It's a very unusual book, um, and wonderfully written. But I just wanted to tell you, as a father of a daughter, and as a grandfather of three granddaughters, that what you did for your dad really touched me deeply, as in, like, here's someone who didn't take a father for granted and let him live through you, which is really unusual. So, human to human, forget the book for a minute. I really like you, Laura, and consider
Oh,
yourself hugged and thanked by a father and grandfather who just recognizes the gift. And what a lucky man your dad is to not only have you for a daughter, but to have a daughter who records what she did in such beautiful lyrical prose, so that the book is a pleasure to read, but it's an emotional pleasure to read this narrative of a gift given. And I just was so touched by that. So that's sort of that's not on your book. That's just heart to heart.
I
So
think
why don't
also,
you, yeah,
I was I think also it speaks to who he was as a father
yeah,
and the kind of woman who he raised me to be confident and believe in myself. And that's just what just kept happening as I lived it out
yeah.
more and
And
more.
the way he launched you to go have these adventures and then
Yeah.
didn't live to see them himself. Anyway, without
All right.
any
Everyone's
more,
waiting for the list, Frank.
yeah, so read the list. Open
All
your
right.
book and read that list.
This is what it said when we found it in my brother's kitchen in 2016.
Yeah,
Things I would like, and he underlined would like, by the way.
yeah.
The term bucket list didn't exist yet when he wrote
No,
this,
and I
and I
and
confirmed it.
you don't really use that in the book except in a summation, as it were. But anyway, go ahead.
Things I would like to do in my lifetime. Number one, live a long, healthy life at least to the year 2020. Provide a comfortable standard of living for my family. Write and have a few novels published. Have 5 songs recorded. Make more money than I need. Talk with the president. Make 3 good family or friends movies. Play the piano or guitar. Type 40 words a minute correctly. Sell millions of dollars worth of merchandise. Make my wife feel happy, healthy, pretty, and young all her life. Give my children, this one always makes me choke up. Give my children the most love, the best education, and best example I can give. Visit New Orleans, visit Paris, visit London, Vienna, Dresden/Berlin, Los Angeles, San Diego, Las Vegas, Chicago, St. Thomas. Run 10 miles straight, swim the width of a river, beat a number one seeded tennis player in a tournament. That's not hard.
Yeah, that's not hard.
Play golf in the 70s a few times. Also, not hard.
Yeah,
I took some poetic license. We'll talk about that later. Correspond with the Pope. Speak to a TV audience. Do a comedy monologue in a nightclub. He checked that one off himself. Be interviewed on a radio program. He also checked that one off. Get my picture in a national magazine. Make money on the stock market. Set up a charitable fund. Drive a Corvette. Teach a class about wine. Have a 34-inch waist again. Own a $200 suit. Own a black tux. Send Joan, that's my mom, on a $1,000 shopping spree. Help Laura win a scholarship. Own a large house with our own land. Have my own tennis court. See a World Series game live. He checked that one off. Go to a Super Bowl game. See the NCAA basketball finals. Go to the Rose Bowl. Surf in the Pacific Ocean. Grow a watermelon. Own a wine cellar of fine wines. Plant an apple tree. Skydive at least once.
yeah,
Go sailing by myself. Be invited to a political convention. Help my parents enjoy their retirement. He checked that one off. Pay back my dad $1,000 plus interest. That's the one he marked as having failed. Own a great record collection. He checked that one off. Develop an impressive library. Ride a horse fast. Sing at my daughter's wedding. Dance at my grandchildren's weddings.
yeah. I love all that. Lovely, lovely list. And the book, of course, tells us what you did, what he did, and so forth and so on. So I'm going to start with one question that just got my curiosity, that's sort of about the book, and that is, how would you describe your father at age 29 writing that list? You didn't know him then. What do you know about him then? Because it's an interesting mix of things. It's not, some of it is material ambition, some of it is spiritual, some of it is artistic travel. It's a little bit of an insight into who he was. It's also definitely a list that a younger person would come up with,
Mhm.
because at, say, age 72, my list would be very different. But I'm thinking back to when I was 29, and what would I, have, if I had ever written a list like that, it would have included some similar things, places I wanted to go, things I would like to do. Um, so who do you think he was writing that list? What kind of a guy? Would you have liked that person? Did you know that person as he got older? How do you
Yeah,
assess the young man, the
he
younger
always
man?
did have a youthful quality to him, you know?
Hmm.
So not that different. I think it's sort of like when we're in our 20s, we haven't experienced much of life yet.
Yeah.
So we haven't had anything beat us down or disappoint us, really, which is something
Hmm.
that happens more as you get older. I did know him. He was just that amorphous face that was hugging me probably when I was a baby. But, I've discovered so much more about him, finding his
Yeah.
old journals and other lists that he wrote at that time. That what surprised me was quite how organized he was. He was very
Mm.
intentional. One of my favorite books, my husband's a big proponent of this, is Ryan Holiday's The Daily Stoic.
Hmm.
Read this every day. I've sort of discovered that my dad was a fan of intentional living. I found a vow he wrote to himself at age 22, and he wrote, inspired by Napoleon Hill. And at
Yeah.
that time, I didn't know who Napoleon Hill was, but that sent me down a rabbit hole of like learning about the law of attraction.
Sure.
And to understand, I knew my dad was very well read. He was an American Studies major at University of Delaware. He was a writer himself. He self-published his own book in the 70s. He always talked about it, but for me, it was like the embarrassing dad who won't stop talking about his
Yeah. Yeah.
self-published book. But I actually finally read the whole thing. The president I ended up talking with was Jimmy Carter, and I
Yeah.
pulled
No, I
out
know that
that
part.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I pulled out the book, just scouring it for Jimmy Carter's name, hoping that might have been the president, because he was president in 1978 when I
Sure.
wrote the list. So, it was interesting to figure out why he would have come up with each of the ideas.
Yeah.
For President Carter, for example, I found out that in 1978, uh, there was an ABC news show where they actually, Cronkite was the name I'm looking for. Cronkite would field calls from American citizens to the White House, and Jimmy
Mm.
Carter would take them.
Yeah.
Like an actual president would be talking to people on
We talk to
TV.
people. I remember that.
Yeah.
I didn't talk to him, but I remember that
Okay,
that
good. So
actually
you're
having
validating
happened.
it for me.
Yes.
But
No,
that's
that actually
probably why my
happened.
dad thought that he could do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can remember going down to Americus. I think that's the town he was near, and
Yep. Yep.
everybody talking about him who kind of knew him like a neighbor. And then, of course, in the book, there's a picture of you and the president,
Mhm.
um, Jimmy Carter. If you're going to pick a president to meet, this is a good one. I mean, his
Yeah.
name stands the test of time, unlike some people, but he's been
Well, and
great.
yet I knew very little about him. I mean, right behind me, that whole bookshelf, that's all my father's list.
Yeah,
Every
that's
single
lovely.
book on there, because I was studying, I always call it the school of dad. I was
Yeah,
studying what made him tick at that time. And so
yeah,
you have to have, I learned anything about him, about who he was. I think he was incredibly idealistic,
yeah,
incredibly optimistic, someone who really believed he was going to change the world.
yeah. Hey, I'm going to read something from your book. Let me just look. You don't have to read this. This is down near, I'm jumping around page 240, 243, something like that. I pulled this out kind of as a way to open this discussion with you, and I'm going to simply read it.
Okay.
I was grateful when the pandemic started that I'd been on the mission to finish the list being what we just talked about. Everyone kept talking about uncertainty. It was as though they believed their lives had been sure, and now they couldn't be sure anymore. Before finding my dad's list, I had taken jobs where I wasn't treated well, where I worked too many hours, just so I could have certainty. It was what I'd been taught to want. And I loved you bringing that up because, one of my big things in life as I've gotten older is moving past former certainties to a place where basically all certainties to me seem somewhat bogus. Um, and I know that's pulled out of context, and I know that it's not what your book is about, but I just thought it was so interesting for you to phrase that question about certainty that way. And it made the book so interesting to me because you're kind of a philosopher in some ways. You step back and you kind of look at that. My COVID experience was like yours, one that I actually look back on fondly. And as you put in your book, irrespective of the fact that we know it was a tragedy, um, our version of the tragedy was fortunately good. You wrote, I got to hole up with three of my grandchildren and basically made Camp Schaeffer here and got to know them in a way that I never could have. They live nearby and I see them all the time, but this was intense. It was every single day. They weren't in school. And so, while you were using COVID to write, I was doing that. And then out of that comes this expression of yours about certainty. So let's go there for a minute, even though it's not what your book is about. In your own intellectual journey as a writer and a human being and a lover and someone married and a father who got divorced and then left this bucket list, how do you view your life lessons in terms of that paragraph? And we can talk about that a little bit.
I think, I was under the impression when I wrote that and when the pandemic started, I was under the impression that that was a thing that was most people's goal who I knew.
Yeah,
That's what good parents do, right? Good parents teach their children to find some semblance of security
yeah,
so that once they're adults, the parents know they've done a good job and they don't have to worry about the kids because they have a foundation. So I'm not saying like don't do that in that sentence. Like you do need to have a foundation in life. Don't just go like willy-nilly. I don't think that that's an easy path to
yeah,
have no foundation at all. But I think I was taking it to an extreme level of, in the beginning of the book, I think my initial conflict beyond grieving for my dad and wanting
yeah,
awareness for distracted driving, which was he died because of a teenager on a phone.
yeah,
uh, my initial catalyst was that I felt out of place. I felt
yeah,
like, okay, to have that security, I need to have children in a house somewhere and settle down. I'm a really creative spirit, and I wasn't sure that that was calling to me the way I thought it
sure,
was supposed to.
sure,
So to find that as I did my dad's bucket list items, what actually helped me more than craving security was letting it go completely.
mm,
Trusting the list,
yeah,
trusting that whatever is coming my way was meant for me, and
mm,
that if I don't know if I'm going to be able to do a list item or not, that's okay.
yeah,
It's about the experience. It's not about the outcome. So that's really what it was. So by the time the pandemic started in 2020, psychologically, I was in that place where I had learned to see uncertainty as my friend and almost as even something very exciting because
yeah,
every list item of the 54 would have its own way of getting done. I couldn't
yeah,
predict it, and it always turned out to be okay. So I
mm,
think that's what it was. I was developing like a trust level with the uncertainty of being human.
yeah. I like that. I'm going to read something else, and this is a deep dive into a completely different thing. But speaking of your father's death, here was a passage I pulled out. And again, it's down on page 202 or somewhere. A week after my brother's birthday, Stephen and I celebrated our third wedding anniversary at 11 p.m. that night. Already in bed, I reached for my phone. My agent had emailed me. Most of his letter pointed out the problems in the 250 pages I'd sent him. He no longer wanted to represent me. I bolted out of bed and ran to the bathroom. I curled up on the floor by the bathtub and cried from my heart, clasping it. In my mind, I was back at my babysitter's house, sitting and waiting for my mom to come. Dave and Jamie came to visit to New York a week later, and I shared the news with them over lunch. So, what will you do now? Dave asked. I'll keep writing my book. And the reason I pulled that out, of course, as a writer, I get that exactly, and it spoke to me. But also, and I know this will sound weird, um, but you're weeping there at that loss is a level of grief that I think, for a writer and in the creative context, I'm not saying it is as significant as, but at that moment, I think your sorrow mirrors the loss of your father. And I just wanted to throw that out there. I know that's going to sound odd to people, but I totally got that. And you don't say curled up in a fetal position, but let's say you were next to a bathtub, clinging to it, weeping your heart out, Um, I just want to talk about that level of grief when it comes to loss, period, and your father, but also in the context of your agent's reaction. But then the loss of a creative avenue for a creative person. And, think of the painter who goes blind, or the person who loses an agent having worked towards something, someone deprived of something, someone that has a damaging accident and now it changes their life. And I really thought that passage was such a true moment for me, saying, yeah, I know what she's talking about. Been there, done that. I understand this. I get it. This is not an exaggeration. Hearts can break over the loss of a creative ability, but also an opportunity. So talk about that a little bit. Talk about that scene, and then talk about what happened later, and how you got the book published anyway, and a little, take us on that journey, because I was very touched by that.
Thank you. It's funny when you read these, I'm like, is that the version I published? I guess it is.
Hmm.
It's very transparent. It's very vulnerable. And I don't think I even understood until this moment what I meant when I said I felt like I was waiting for my mom to pick me up. Because I think embedded in that loss that I was feeling in my heart
Mm.
was I wanted to give my mom more of a voice in a way. I
Yeah,
saw how hard she was working to raise us kids on her own. I mean, my dad
yeah,
was someone I saw twice a week. So he got the fun parts, and my mom, like a lot of women, a lot of single mothers, was doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And
yeah.
she was just, I was very blessed to have an incredibly wonderful mother.
Mm.
And that's what that was. It was like, I want to have a voice as a woman. I want her to feel like she has one. I mean, I can't speak for her. I'm sure she does feel like she has one. But that's what it was. And I thought I needed some kind of gatekeeper to give me that voice. I
Mm.
thought I needed this agent to be like, oh, yes, I'm going to publish you. It's going to be huge and people are going to listen to, what I wanted to say at that time, which was a life is a life and a life lost on the roads matters too. And here's how much my dad's life actually
Sure.
mattered. So that's really what it was. And I spent that whole summer. My husband told me take what the agent said as constructive. He's pointing out the things that need to be fixed and just use it. So I did that. I spent the whole summer just reworking the manuscript, making it the way I wanted it to be. That
Yeah.
was incredibly freeing for me because I recognized what I like matters. What I care about matters. And that's
Mm.
why the book became the format that it's in, where sometimes you're in the present, sometimes you're in the past. It's sort of shifting. Because I think that's how healing from trauma works.
Mm.
Kind of have a new good thing happen, and then it starts to heal the previous painful definition of yourself that you had. So
Yeah.
that's the format of the book. That's how it felt to me. That was the real feeling of doing this list. And once I did it my way, of course, that's when I all of a sudden things started becoming easy. I found a
Yeah.
wonderful new agent. I'm so grateful to have her. And I think that's what it is when people feel like someone is taking their voice away from them. The truth
Yeah.
of the matter is they actually just need to insist on having one.
Yeah, and I think in book there are different books. There are some books that you'd feel more personal about, but I can't imagine a book that would cut closer to your heart than the one of completing your dad's wish list of things he could have done had he lived long enough. This is about as personal as it gets. So there was a lot you were crying for by that bathtub. If
Yeah.
I could be a little melodramatic, let me reintroduce you in conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest is Laura Carney. Laura is a writer and copy editor in New York. She is the author of My Father's List, How Living My Dad's Dream Set Me Free. And we're talking about that book, and it's a list of things he did not get to do because he was killed in an accident much before his time. And Laura has written a book about her adventures, and that's the right way to put it, in fulfilling his wish list from travel to meeting with the president. And it's an entertaining and good read because Laura is a really terrific writer. So it sounds quirky, a whole book about what she did for her dad. But speaking as a father and grandfather, it certainly got to me on an emotional level, as in, yes, people speak a little melodramatically about, well, someone passes away, but he or she is alive in my heart. Okay, that's great. Glad to live in your heart, but you're the kind of daughter everybody would really want. And that is now she's out there living a little bit of my dream in honor of my memory and doing something for me. So I was very touched by that. Let me jump into another quote in the book that I want to read. I was seeing something my father had never seen, would never get to see, and probably would have very much wanted to. It wasn't until we found the list 4 years later that I knew this was true. When Stephen saw me crying, he said, "Oh," and hugged me. I said, "My dad would have loved how beautiful this is. Just talk about what this was that you're talking about. Talk about that moment. And I like the way you keep bringing in people, um, in terms of the relationships like Stephen and others. I guess the point I want to make with that quote is there's a story there that I want you to tell, but also you seem to be someone who acknowledges the fact that you only get through life um, with a little help from your friends. I mean, not to be too superficial about it, but I like the lack of independence in your book. You're a feminist and you're striking out on your own and you're skydiving and you're doing all this stuff. But the reader is very aware, just as you spoke so warmly of the agent who did help you, of the fact that you're not one of these dreadful people who thinks that, you're doing it your way and all alone. You understand the serendipity of connection with others. And I think that's something that gives the book a certain warmth. Correct me if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I just think that's a big element that runs through the book, a thread that runs through. Who stood up for you?
Well, I think we're living in a time where it's like we tend to become siloed. I mean, I think people
Yeah,
are talking about that a lot lately, that we have our phones, and ironically, it was a phone involved in my father's death, and he
yeah,
was a person, he had the Irish gift of gab. He was the person who connected with everyone he met, very warm. So for me to go after his dreams, everybody
mm,
wants to go after dreams. And I had all these people showing up in my life to help me. Like I actually created two rules in the beginning of the project. I will never ask for money, and I'm never going to ask someone to help me.
yeah,
Because I realized that when somebody volunteered, it was a big commitment they were making, because it
mm,
would change them too. Because there's something about giving of your heart to something purely because it's a good thing to do. It
yeah,
has an authenticity to it, and that changes you. So
yeah,
after a while, I actually started giving a caveat when someone's like, "Hey, like in year three, I'd love to help you with this item." I'm like, "Okay, but be ready," because it
yeah,
had changed me at that point. And it really, it was like a balm. It was like this thing that was helping me have faith in humanity and
yeah,
understand that everybody understands loss and
yeah,
most people are good. And I genuinely just had, I always like to say I had 54 helpers with 54 items. And it was
yeah,
because I was suddenly expressing the grief. I wasn't hiding it like a thing to be ashamed of. I was
yeah,
sharing it like a thing that everybody gets. So
yeah,
that was a big part of it too. So when I was standing there looking at the ocean, that's right at the beginning of the book, it was as a person who has allowed herself to feel very isolated and to
mm,
feel as though her problems are unique to her alone. And it's
yeah,
only because I had become someone who thought, oh, being an adult means I'm tough and I just don't ever show my weakness and I'll get
mm,
through it somehow. I think as adults, we're all human beings and we're supposed to help each other. We're supposed to
yeah.
connect.
Yeah, let me just jump to another place. This one actually also is pretty early in your book. I'm just going to throw it out there and let you talk about this scene. But I enjoyed it just as a piece of writing, so forgive me to draw it out of context. I collected myself when we started walking back. Do you think we should get married? Stephen asked in a nervous, nonchalant voice. I love that nervous, nonchalant voice. The question was no different than if he'd said, "Do you think we should go see a movie?" My heart sank. That's how you're going to ask me? We'd been together 9 years. I'd started asking about marriage 5 years in. When we moved into our first apartment, my high school best friend was getting married, and I was her maid of honor. And her friends asked me often when Stephen would propose, as though it was something I should be concerned about. He said at the time it didn't seem like a great plan financially, and it wasn't. I'd just been laid off from my first magazine job and was freelancing. He was working in his first job in his field, graphic design. Neither paid well. Mine because I was spending all my money on my high school best friend's wedding. I find that very amusing in parentheses. The fact that we managed to afford 5 days in LA 4 years later was nothing short of a miracle or the result of extreme persistence. Despite that, I internalized the pressure to be someone's wife, and I projected it onto him, most notably after family members' weddings. Anyway, I just love that passage, and I guess I'm going to use that to intrude on your life. Hey, you wrote a book about your life. There's a lot of intimate stuff in there. Talk about your relationships, boyfriends, husband, how you've done all this busy stuff. You're living this list. You've lost your father young and he died young. And then your mom steps up for you. Now you're sort of talking to me on this podcast about the fact that you want to make sure you give her credit. You're obviously very aware, as we said a moment ago, about relationships and connections. What sort of girlfriend are you? Were you? What sort of vision do you have of relationships? I got married when I was 17. I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18. We've been together 54 years, not because we had some secret, but purely by luck and forbearance and the goodness of her heart and ability to forgive and allow me to grow up a little bit and so forth. There's a whole story there. But what it's made me passionately interested in is about, you might call the fabric, dynamic, and guts of other people's view of relationships. Married, not married, with children, not with children, gay, straight. I'm so interested in all those formulations. So if you don't mind me intruding, how do you view relationships? How did that journey change you? But also, where are you right now? How do you look back? What do what's the chemistry of relationships in your view? Who are
Um,
you?
I'm happy you mentioned who am I? I'm happy you mentioned my mom again because it's like I always tell her she is a huge part of why I was able to finish this list,
Yeah,
as well as my husband, because here
yeah,
I have these two people who are so in my court, so cheering me on, even though they didn't totally know what was happening either.
yeah.
Like, where is she going with this? And it didn't matter. They're 100% behind me all the way. And my mom's just a very strong woman. And my dad, I had a unique relationship with him, I think, because even though I only saw him twice a week, he and I share the reasons I think this is later on in the book, but he was sort of gender blind.
Hmm.
So he raised me as though I could be a boy. Like he raised me as someone who can do anything men can do. And he always told
Hmm.
me that all the time. So I think once I entered relationships, I was destined to marry a man who also believed that. Like my
Yes,
my
yes,
husband really loves strong women.
yeah,
He loved being supportive of me and my career. And the conflict I think I was going through at that age, I believe I started the book when I was 35. That's how far back I went. The
yeah.
conflict I was going through was that even though I had this treasure on my hands of this man who was going to do that for me,
Hmm.
I was conditioned by society to think that, oh no, as a wife, I'm this, that, and the other thing.
Hmm.
As a girlfriend, I'm this, that, and the other thing, because that is what society tends to do. It tends to view women as possessions and men as the subjects of their own existence. So
Mm.
I was very fortunate that I had parents who were not that. Um,
Yes,
and then to find a husband who also was not that. It was me who was the problem. That I had to understand that to reject that and to say, no, I'm going to be the subject of my own life and I'm going to go
yeah,
out and do things I care about. That was the rebellion for me. And,
yeah.
and, and it was scary. It was really scary for me to embrace that.
Well, you're talking about how your father raised you and your potential to do things, and I'll just grab one quote out of your book that sort of illustrates that. And then I'll talk about why I connect to it so deeply. River swimming struck me as something that should be done in the South. I pictured a Norman Rockwell setting with a rope swing, a glassy water surface, maybe a lift, a la Dirty Dancing, film not far from the French Broad, and you can explain that. And I like the river's history. It's the third oldest river in the world. Early settlers called it the French Broad because it drained into French territory, but Cherokee had other names for it. One meant racing waters, another meant chattering child. Talk about the whole river swimming thing. And then, I live near a river and we swim in it, and it's nowhere in the South where it's warm. It's up north in Massachusetts. But we float down that river on an outgoing tide because it's tidal. And it's one of the big experiences of our life. And we have a thing, a rock we sit on and so forth. So I love the river swimming. I love the whole just notion of river swimming. But then I want you to talk a little bit about how that fits in with your book and also who you are as a person, this woman who does things and at the same time is grateful for a dad who said, yeah, you can do all this stuff. You're not an appendage to some male. You're your own thing. Man, that
Yeah,
kind
I
of
mean,
just, yeah,
that was still early, right? That was early in the journey. So I was still just sort of discovering this at
yeah,
that point. And I think everybody loves the river swim chapter because it's so like there's something idyllic about it and
yeah,
it's very visual. And yeah, I have family down in the South, and so I really enjoyed that experience. It felt very Americana to me. I
yeah,
found all this stuff about like Mark Twain and Fitzgerald, Thomas Wolfe, like just river related writers.
yeah.
which I thought my dad would appreciate. I do have some little trivial pieces of history in the book, but the reason that's there, it's not just to like, give you a feeling or paint a scene. It's because that's what my bond with my dad was. He was a
Yeah,
writer. And when we would talk about authors and we would talk about American history. So that's what that is. But I think the reason the river swim was so important was because water's emotions.
yeah,
And I can't tell you how many people I've met since doing that swim who've said to me, I can't swim, I'm afraid of swimming. And
yeah.
it's like, it's because there's so much unknown.
Well, didn't your mom say there are two kinds of people, the ones who, people who can swim and people who can't? Wasn't that your mother?
She had a traumatic experience with it when she was a kid. That's what I think
Yeah,
people who don't swim had. Yeah.
yeah. She talked about it to you. I just remember that jumps out. I don't have a
Right,
quote on it.
yeah. So I wanted to give her props in that chapter because she made sure we knew how to swim. I mean,
Sure.
she was the one giving us all the lessons and making sure
Yeah,
we knew how to do things. So I
yeah,
I knew that she was the reason I could do it.
yeah,
Also, she was a guidance counselor, so very good at helping us with our emotions.
yeah. That's
But
good.
yeah, but anyway, the other thing I started to understand when I was doing that river swim, I think at one point I start talking about how I had recently been researching Gertrude Ederle. There's a great movie out there about her right now called The Young Woman in the Sea. It's on
Yeah,
Disney Plus if anyone wants to see it. Daisy Ridley plays her. And I had learned that the way she got through the toughest parts of her swim across the English Channel was by singing. And
yeah.
that reminded me of how my dad used to sing. Like he was one of those people who sang more than he spoke. So
Mm,
as I got through the most scary, toughest part of that river swim, that memory returned to me of how
yeah.
he would try to teach me how to do a back float, which I couldn't handle because there was like water going in my ears and I hated it.
Yeah.
And I realized, oh, this is the back float. This
Mm,
is like if I just start singing and relaxing the way he taught me to do, I'm going to get across this. And it was really, that was a really beautiful list item for me because it helped me to see just how fortunate I was
mm.
to have had two parents who were very different people, and yet together they formed something perfect, and they gave me everything I needed.
Yeah, it's lovely. Jumping to something else here, the spring of my junior year, my history teacher assigned me a paper on the women's movement. I was excited because I loved feminism. But once I started reading The Feminine Mystique, I couldn't understand how there was this group of women's libbers in the 1960s, but also one in the late 1800s, those who got women the vote. I couldn't make sense of what had transpired in between. How had they lost so much momentum? And then you go on about reading Betty Friedan, et cetera, et cetera. But I just thought, I wanted to go there a little bit. You talk about feminism. And I love that you kind of stumbled across it, but that your first question is like, oh, wait a minute. What's that middle bit? What happened there? So that's not what your book is about, but I just want to go there a little bit because I'm just interested in what's in your brain. Tell me what's in your brain about that.
I think the book is about that, but it's about one person's experience being an American woman in this
Yeah, I
time.
mean, it's not about Betty Friedan, et
Right.
cetera.
No, 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 no. Yeah, it's just that was a project I was working on for my history class, and I just remembered as I was revisiting that time in my life that that was
Yeah,
also the same time that I realized I was ill, that I had clinical depression,
yeah,
and it became too much for me. And basically, as a kid, like, so when I was younger, I was in the gifted program, and it was like my all-nighters that I would pull were rewarded by my
yeah,
teachers because it's like, oh, look how creative this is. Look at this giant poster she made. But by the time I got to high school, it was less about these great feats of strength and more about can I balance 7 classes in a day? Can
hmm,
I shift my attention? And I didn't know yet then that I had ADHD and shifting attention was a thing that was challenging for me.
yeah,
So I was still putting forth these like great feats of strength. And when it came to that, it was almost like my innocence had been robbed of me because
hmm,
I recognized for the first time, oh my God, like I thought the women's movement was new. Like I thought
yes,
it was
yeah,
just my mom's generation in the 60s fighting for this. Really, it started back in the 1800s. Like,
yeah,
I didn't know enough history yet to understand that, activism and causes for freedom, for equal rights, like they take a really long time in our
yes, they
country.
do.
So it was very depressing for me to
Mm,
realize, oh, that's the gender I am. Like this
yeah.
is my life. At that time, it was like an awakening. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, you brought this up and I'll just jump in here. My depression at 16 was like that tunnel. You referred to something else, except I couldn't crawl out and nobody else could crawl in. After a while, I gave up hope of ever joining anyone again. The people in my life whom I normally enjoyed life with were blissfully unaware that I was stuck. And if I tried to explain to them, they didn't believe me. And then jumping ahead to another thing about this, depression and the counseling you got or didn't get. A week later, my mom took me to see her former doctor. Dr. Dutton told me about antidepressants and he put me on a brand new one, Zoloft. He said we'd know in a few weeks whether I had depression and if it worked. And then a little later, you say getting a diagnosis of ADHD means extra time on tests, but this doesn't translate when you're a fine arts major where
Yeah.
there are no tests, only assignments. And then you go a little longer and you say, as Mr. Raymond asked what I saw in my mind, I told him I could see a small girl by herself sitting on a bed in an empty room. I said, I felt like she was sitting in my heart. She's lonely, I said, crying. She feels like nobody listens to her. And then partly because of all the medications, et cetera, by January, and I'm jumping, these are all quotes,
Yeah.
they don't go together. I couldn't fit into my clothes. I complained to Dr. Dutton, who reluctantly took me off Zyprexa, if that's the way you say it,
Mhm.
but said he had to replace it with another drug. A few days later, this is somebody else, another place. A few days later, my mom got me started with a new doctor, Dr. Rowan, who said there was no reason for me to be on so many drugs. And then, you're admitted somewhere and later. There were only 7 of us when I was admitted, and I was the youngest. Esther was the sweetest old lady I'd ever met, but she kept talking about how thirsty she was. Another effect of her medications. Okay, enough of that. But I'm giving my listeners the idea that a big chunk of your journey has been a fight over mental health issues and
Mhm.
medication and weight gain and doctors and who would listen to you and so on. And again, I don't want to just quote the book back. I want that to be a way for you to get into talking about how you now, not your story then, they can read the book for that, but you go through a journey that gives you an authentic insight and not only into mental health issues, but I think probably kind of like my faith journey or as I escaped my evangelical background, hindsight's a different thing. So I want to go to hindsight now. How do you look at that arc, the diagnosis, the medication, your journey, how you felt, as you look back, you have that very poignant passage about seeing a child alone. Okay, now how do you look at yourself through that whole thing? And where are you today as we speak? Are you past all that? Where are you? Is it still part? I just want to go there and let you talk about it any way you want, but it's a big part of your book.
Yeah, well, that is a big part of chapter 3, which actually is, I like to tell people, like, after you get past that long flashback, there aren't going to be other ones quite like that, other than my dad's death in the next chapter, just
Yeah,
because it's like that was a formative time in my life. Is when I
yeah.
was deciding who I was and doing this list and getting to express my pride for my father in
Oh,
the
and by
ways.
the way, art therapy was my favorite time of the week.
Yep.
But not because they let us draw. It was because they let us go outside. Sorry, I just had to say that because I love that line. Anyway, okay, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I felt it was important that I shared my experience of that time as I
Mhm.
remember it because, you know, it's not so much a thing where I felt like I need people to know that this happened because I actually found it very difficult to write about. And it's difficult because when that happens to someone in a family, the entire family's affected by it. It
Sure,
was
of
never
course.
just my experience. My mom probably was hurt by it more than I was because that's how parents are. And my mom really loves me. So I think it was a thing where it was like I felt at that time shame. I
Mm.
felt shame on top of the illness. And I think that happens to a lot of teenagers. I think we're living in a time now where it's even worse because we have the comparison game happening online every day. So
Yeah,
it's like, I think teenagers, even more than in my time, want to be a certain thing and want popularity and love and to be liked and to be perfect. There's a real emphasis on like the perfection of these
sure.
photos.
Well, and
So
they're even comparing themselves visually to other people.
yeah, yeah, and that's not what we're about. We're about
No,
what's
it's
in
endless.
here. So that's why that was getting EMDR therapy when that happened, when I saw
Yeah.
that little girl in my chest. And it was sort of this revelation. EMDR is great. I couldn't recommend it highly enough, but it was this revelation of, oh, okay, I'm a person who has an illness, and that's okay. I don't have to put shame on top of it as
Yeah.
well. And I need to help myself. And like later, when I talked about my hospital experience, that was a reiteration of that. Like I
Mhm.
learned at a very young age, and I view this as a gift. Like the stuff I struggled with at a young age, I think of in hindsight as a gift
Yeah.
because I learned so much independence from it. Like
Yeah.
I would never have moved to New York to try to find a career in magazines and then later meeting my future husband and having the life I have now. I never would have been brave enough to do that at 25 if I hadn't been in that hospital at 23.
No, no, I totally get that.
Like recognizing, oh, I can save me. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm in charge of my happiness. And I think a lot of people aren't lucky enough to have that
Yeah.
experience, right? So I think that it was a gift. And reflecting on it now, especially as compared to all of these list items and also needing to move past my anger over my dad's death, it really helped me to see, oh, even the painful, just uncomfortable, difficult things that happen to us in life, they're all gifts. They're all a
Yeah.
gift in some way if we can just find the lesson.
Hey, let's I told you I would do this to you again. Hold your book up again and tell us the title because I read all mine on Kindle and usually I'd be waving your book around to advertise it as a wonderful read. And tell us the title instead of me reading it.
It's my father's list, How Living My Dad's Dreams Set Me Free, and that's me on the cover.
Yeah, yeah.
Very
Little you.
small,
There's
like
some
the little
big
girl in my heart.
yeah, there's big U's in the book. Hey, if I was your publisher and was pulling one paragraph out of the book to stick on the cover that would make me, Frank Schaeffer, crack the book open and say, "What the hell is this?" I made a little note up here. I put notes in my notes and I put interesting woman exclamation in red above this one 3-line little paragraph on page 86, I believe. The year after the hospital, I applied for every journalism job I could find. I also emailed and messaged whatever guy struck my fancy online, no matter where he lived. And I thought, okay, I want to know what the hell the rest of this book is about. Who is this woman? Because that's such
Yeah,
a that's let's just unpack that one more time. I love juxtapositions. Juxtapositions are always the trick of a great sentence. And if you didn't have an explanation, this would be so great. If someone said, "Oh, well, what's this book about?" I said, "Let me just try this one sentence here," and the year after the hospital, I applied for every journalism job I could find. I also emailed, messaged whatever guy struck my fancy online, no matter where he lived. Okay, I want to know who you are. So I love that paragraph. If you just want something, if you ever make the poster, that's it. That's the poster. That's the
yeah, there are
paragraph.
just too many of them. I couldn't possibly get into all the detail.
Yeah, but I mean, like when you look at that, I'm saying, yeah, that's quirky. The
Yeah,
combination of career, mental health, career, and then either chasing or wanting to meet the right person or persons. I just thought that was a very interesting juxtaposition of three subjects that you don't normally associate. I mean, one's the career quest, the other one is the mental health quest, and then so forth and so on. Do you want to
yeah.
unpack any of that, or should we just not go
Well,
there?
it sums up me at 25, right? And
Yeah,
then a year later, you can add father just died because of a distracted driver. So that's
yeah,
why. That's why I had to go on this journey. That's why I had
yeah,
to write this book. Because that 25-year-old who was like, whoa, this is a
yeah,
lot, she was still in here and she had
yeah,
something to say. That's really what it was.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, to unpack that, I found him. I found the one. And it was me just exploring and being in a very rebellious stage of my life.
Yeah.
Like,
So let me jump a little further ahead in the book. When I filmed an interview for Inside Edition, the reporter asked which was the most impossible list item. So by this time, people are asking you about it. Talk with the president, I said. The president I'd least like to speak with was in office. But I really did think it was impossible. When I was a teen, my mom sometimes called my dad grandiose. Oh, he used to write these lists of famous people he'd meet, she'd say. Your father's not always living in reality. And again, a very interesting, series of juxtapositions. your dream to fulfill the list, your mother calling him a bit grandiose, you wanting to meet a president, and in the end, you did meet Jimmy Carter, and there's a picture of you and him in the book. Um, so let's just talk about that. We could unpack every single item in the list and talk about the quest. And I loved, you're talking about the Schönbrunn Garden in Vienna, which I know well because I grew up in Europe and we would go there, and all the rest of it. So there's so many things that are wonderful in the book. It's a clever device, by the way, because the list involves travel and all sorts of stuff. So let's just unpack the quest to meet the president and how that worked out. Let's talk about meeting Jimmy Carter. How'd you get to stand next to him and get a picture taken finally? Let's just go there.
Well, I mean, I do want to add though that she was right. My dad was very grandiose. I mean, that was my experience of him as well.
Yeah,
That he was a big ideas guy.
yeah,
He wasn't necessarily always a follow through guy,
yeah.
and he was the one who would excite people about things. And sometimes the dreams he would have felt very big. So but how did I make it happen? I mean, that's the feeling I was going into that with was, am I now becoming grandiose? Because I
Yeah,
didn't want to be that. And I wrote to every living president. I asked all of their assistants or, whoever I managed to find, whoever, usually it was the media departments I wrote to and told them about my mission and asked if I could meet someone. And it just happened that Jimmy Carter's people wrote me back.
of
And
course. Yeah,
they said, so we're going to give you a tour of his foundation and of his library. And at that point in time, I knew absolutely nothing about Jimmy Carter.
yeah,
And I spent 2 weeks researching the heck out of him. And then by the time we finally got down there, this was already sort of starting to happen at this point. This is year one of doing my dad's list, but these serendipitous things were starting to come together for me. And because we hiked a mountain at a certain time, we got to the hotel at a certain time, and then we met one of Jimmy Carter's biographers who had written several books about him.
yeah,
I could hold my own in the conversation because I had been researching him so much for 2 weeks. So he helped us. We think that's the funny part. He still won't admit to it that he actually helped us, but we think he did. And then we saw him again the next day. His name is Art Milnes. He's this wonderful journalist from Canada. And then the next day at the church, when I got up there to talk to Jimmy Carter, I was actually able to have a few words with him, and that
mm,
was really momentous because the list item didn't say meet the president; it said talk with the president. And
lovely.
they even told us in the church service he does not do that.
Mm,
Like don't hold him up. Like everyone's in line taking a picture with him, and they're like, don't talk to him. So I was like, okay, I'm breaking the church service rules, but I have to see if I can get this done. And he was great. He was just such a kind. Just I learned a lot from him. As
yeah,
far as you said, I'm philosophical. My life philosophy's changed quite a bit from just that one day in Jimmy Carter's Sunday school lesson.
yeah. Yeah, I never met Jimmy Carter, but that's always been my impression of him through people who have known him. Um, Terrific. I mean, if you were going to pick somebody to meet him, what a wonderful thing that he was such a lovely person on top of it. It wasn't just
Oh
a
yeah.
meet the famous person. Lovely.
Well,
Um,
what he said in the church that was so inspiring to me was just this idea that we're creating our own lives. That
yeah,
was what I had never looked at it that way before.
yeah, I love that. Oh, and of course, wasn't he good at doing that after he left the office of the
That's
presidency?
right.
Of creating his own life right up to the end. All his Habitat for Humanity stuff and the rest of it. This wasn't virtue signaling. This was all real. It was a whole lifestyle. It was really who he was.
Yeah. He's not a status or titles guy.
Not
He's
at
in it
all.
for the work.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful person. Um, you're right. In the winter of 2019, as I tried to figure out what I'd do to make ends meet, my brother was buying a brand new 4-bedroom home in New England. I was happy for him, but couldn't stop comparing my life with his. I tried not to worry about it and focus on what I was doing, which was a lot for a miserable invalid. And so,
I'm
once
being
again,
sarcastic.
I know, but I mean, hey, again, listen, when you read a paragraph or a sentence in a book and you're finished, you put a note in it saying, "Who is this?" That's a good sign because you're pulling us into the story, almost like you're the character in a novel. And you're very curious, how does this all end? I mean, jealous of your brother's good fortune. And then, of course, you stop and think, yeah, well, gee, I've been there, done that. I mean, don't we compare each other and especially family members?
Yep.
So talk about that a little bit. Just, okay, you're a quirky, unusual person. You've done a weird, strange thing with a big chunk of your life. I'm not saying that. I'm saying one could say that. And on top of that, you're a little bit dissatisfied and think you could have done more because you're comparing, both finances and income, but also, status, achievement, or simple buying houses. So how does this book settle? I guess this is my segue into saying, how did this book be received by the rest of your family or people who knew your dad or close people and so forth? Because obviously, if you're comparing yourself to him, your brother, looking at what he's got, now he's sitting there saying, yeah, and she wrote a book about our family and sort of outed this list that my father wrote, not knowing that it would become a list published at the end of a book of things my sister wanted to achieve and wrote a book about. There's a lot there to wonder about.
Yeah,
As
well, I
someone
mean,
who's written memoirs, and had reaction from my family to them, again, writer to writer, off the record, how did that all go down?
well, I mean, it's always a mistake to compare yourself to anyone, because we're all living our own lives. And I felt that what I was experiencing at that time was this concern that I was becoming too much like my dad's grandiosity, like I was
Mm,
saying before, and that I was taking a route that I didn't know I was going to take in my life. And I was
yeah,
fearing for myself. I was acting from my own insecurities, which had absolutely nothing to do with him, which
yeah, of
he
course.
so it was just me showing that insecurity because I felt that people could relate to it.
Yeah.
Um, it's a very real thing that happens to people. I'll never do it again. It was a mistake that I felt that way.
Well,
But
I'd go further. I wouldn't put it that way. I wouldn't say it's a thing that happens to people. I would say it's something that happens to everyone. And anyone who denies that, of course, we compare ourselves to other people, whether it's family or just someone out there. We do it all the time.
yeah, but it's just an image. It's just your image in your head, and it's not
Yeah.
a full person.
But let me go somewhere that's even more interesting to me because I think, I'd love your thoughts on this because you've done some hard living. I think the worst comparison we make is what we could have done if we had taken a slightly different turn at some point in our life.
Yeah.
You could have written a novel, you could have done this, you could have done that. If I had stuck with my painting, because I'm a pretty good painter, instead of getting into the low end of the movie business and making some shit movies, where could have I gotten myself? On the other hand, my wife says, well, one of our best friends is a very famous painter. I mean, big time, like Basil Artfeld type painter, met, and he's a lonely guy just sitting there painting all day. And he has actually a very small white life, even though he's tremendously successful. She says, would you really rather be that than being able to sit here and talk to Laura about her interesting book? I mean, we not only compare, we sort of relive the path we've gone on and compare ourselves to ourselves. I'm not saying you do this. I'm just throwing that out because I'd like to hear you talk about it. I think you're a wise person. You
Well, I mean,
understand
my
stuff.
brother is a very inspiring person
Yeah,
because he was doing, as I said earlier, choosing his own life. He was creating his own life.
yeah,
And sometimes when we see people doing that, there's some kind of pang inside of us that happens. And instead of recognizing, oh, I could create my own life too, we choose to be envious. You know what
yeah,
I mean? It's like doing that requires work. Like it requires actual inner work on ourselves. So
yeah.
really that's where I came to in the story, which was
Mhm.
this is wonderful that he has what he has and he's doing what he's doing and he's an amazing provider for his family and just who he is as a person is someone I admire a great deal. So that
Mhm.
was where I got to with it because I recognize like we're not supposed to do that. We're not
No, no,
supposed to,
I know you
yeah,
recognize that, but my point was I think we do it to ourselves. We compare
yeah,
ourselves to
yep,
ourselves in terms of, oh, what I could have done if I'd done this or that. And I look back on my life and in some way I have some regrets, but the most amazing thing I see is that the doors that have opened for me most frequently have been because my best laid plans didn't work out. It's actually my
yeah.
failures that opened the best doors.
I think that's true. It's the more of the comfort with uncertainty thing again.
Hey, I'm going to jump to a slightly different subject here. I was invited onto more podcasts. In a pre-interview, one host said to me, so I assume you've given up on having a family. I told Stephen later, which led to a conversation I didn't want to have. Though Stephen had wanted kids when we met, he'd changed his mind, especially with the way the world was now. He said, I sobbed, I hid my face in my pillow. I told him I viewed the world differently. He said he was 80% against it. I said it was 80% for it. We decided to pick up the conversation again after. our Iron Man, you can explain that, which he'd agreed to do with me, but I didn't know if I had that much time. And again, this is your book and you put that in there, but in talking about comparing ourselves to other people, and I tried to go to another place and saying, comparing ourselves to ourselves, what have I done with my life? That passage, and I did not mean to set that up that way. That's just serendipity. Um, um, but that passage sort of is what I'm talking about. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where we look back on things. What if, do you want to go there at all, or is that
Sure.
what you want to say on the page?
Yeah, I mean, that was, I think if you're someone who wants to raise a family, it's very helpful to 100% know that you want to do that, you
Yeah,
know? And I realized at some point after that conversation that I was coming at that the same way that I was with that pressure I put on myself to be married. That
yeah,
my chief concern actually was, will people judge me? I mean, I even had a doctor once, like a gynecologist told me that people were going to judge me if I didn't have children, which is not a nice thing to say to your
Wait, was
patient.
his name Elon Musk?
No, it was a woman. No,
Oh, okay.
she meant well. She was trying to protect me, you know. But it was like being a woman in this day and age that can happen, and I was afraid of it. And at some point, I recognized, like, oh, like, is it okay? I love being an aunt. I think I'm a good aunt. Is it
Yeah,
okay that that's what I am? I
yeah,
don't. That's not what I foresaw for myself. So really, it
yeah.
was an inner journey.
I just one little paragraph jumped out at me just because it's so mirrored my experience during COVID. After Stephen and I were vaccinated, we rejoined the world. And then
Yeah,
you say, first we visited his mother and then my stepbrother Scott in Delaware, stopping to buy our new bikes. But I just love that. After Steve and I were vaccinated, we rejoined the world. We tend to forget these moments, but I remember, after this year of isolation, which, as I said earlier, went wonderfully for us because we were, in a little pod with our grandchildren. So it was a real opportunity of closeness. But that said, it was such a time of fear and strangeness. And I can remember being able to get a vaccination finally and lining up, with a whole bunch of other people in a parking lot. And literally, as the needle went into my arm, tears of joy on my cheeks
yeah,
because it's like, okay, the nightmare is not over, but this fearful moment in time. And later I got COVID, but a light case because I'd been vaccinated. But I think we tend to push this memory aside, but I'll bet you and me are not the only people who could write the phrase, after I got vaccinated, I rejoined the world. I just loved that. It jumped out at me.
thank you. Yeah, I mean that's sort of how I felt at the time because we had quarantined pretty strictly.
Yeah.
Because I'm a very literal person. That was part of it. Uh,
Yeah.
I actually realized later, I didn't know this then. I realized later I had some lingering PTSD from my dad's sudden death.
Yeah.
Like I was very afraid I would lose my husband the same way
Yeah.
and
I
not
can
say
understand that.
goodbye to him in a hospital, which when a father dies in a car crash, you don't get to say goodbye. So it was that for me. But also my husband has severe asthma and I was trying to protect him. So we really were, in retrospect, I have depression, so COVID wouldn't have been great for me either.
No,
So
I understand.
yeah, yeah, in retrospect, we were very shut in. We spent
Hmm.
15 months not seeing anyone we loved,
Yeah.
except over Zoom. And it was not easy. It was very, very difficult. At the same time, uh, I think what we were talking about before about how I was so adamant that I fit in with what my concept of being a
Sure.
woman of having all the things and all the boxes checked. I think that time period really got rid of that for me
Yeah,
because
well,
now that
you checked some other boxes. I mean, at the end of your
well,
book, you actually have the check marks on the on fulfilling your dad's
right,
needs.
but
Yes.
also I was just with my husband alone, and maybe a great day for us was we watched all these horror movies while someone is painting our bedroom, and we won't
Yeah,
leave the living room because we're afraid and we have masks on. Like we ran every street in our town. We were now forming our own sense of family, our
sure.
own
No, I
sense of
understand.
marriage, and that was actually very healthy for me.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I get it in another context, and that is having had children and having had grandchildren and so forth. What I'm amazed at age 72 is that Jeannie and I, especially since she had a heart attack 3 years ago, speaking of PTSD, sometimes I sneak up, and then it could go up and, she's taking a nap. If I haven't heard from her for a while, I sneak into the room, make sure she's breathing. Not that she's in any great danger, but it doesn't leave you. Um, one thing you talk about in your book, you say, but my dad was 20 when his favorite writer after Mark Twain, Kurt Vonnegut, published Slaughterhouse-Five, a thinly veiled autobiographical retelling of being in Dresden underground during the bombing. This book changed my father's life and it changed mine. By the way, I read that book when I was very young as well, younger. This book changed my father's life and it changed mine around the same age when he gave it to me. And now here I was in Dresden, satisfying my dad's dream, and maybe witnessing my grandfather's nightmare and reaching my own writing goals. And so it goes. And then another quote a few pages later, or one page later, you say, what I most looked forward to was Gustav Klimt's The Kiss. This painting is special because in true secession style, Klimt took an everyday experience and elevated it to the level of a religious icon. So one of the things I really enjoyed about your book, and I know we can't do everything, but just to mention it, is that when you finally do get somewhere like Vienna, or you talk about Klimt's Kiss, The Kiss, or the Schönbrunn Garden, or whatever it may be, you take the time to describe it very beautifully for the person who hasn't been there, or to someone like me who has been. Just like you read an article in the newspaper, you don't know if they're telling the truth or what they're pointing. But then they describe the village you grew up in, and you say, yeah, they got that right. So they must be getting other things right. Where you were describing things that I know pretty well, like that painting or Vienna, it was like, yeah, she's really nailed it. That it evoked the feeling of being there for me again, which is a real achievement as a writer. I love that. And I mean, I don't have any
Well,
reason to
thank
bring this
you.
up except to just say, good job. I mean, I really enjoyed those parts of your book where the story becomes descriptive. Um,
Yeah, well, there isn't a lot of dialogue in that section, right? Because it's just me,
yeah, exactly.
myself, but I think I think the tone I wanted to set as I was writing that was, I'm a journalist,
Yeah,
so I'm always trying to just imitate what the experience is, like the
sure.
real experience. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of visual descriptions. There's going to be a lot of detail stuff in that part because
Yeah,
it's just me. And I'm trying to establish what is it for a woman who doesn't travel alone to be in two foreign countries for 2 weeks,
yeah,
who loves art and is now in charge of her own time. My husband is an amazing time management expert, and for
yeah,
someone with ADHD, that's very helpful. But sometimes I don't force myself hard enough to actually be good at managing my time. And now here I was in a situation where I keep having all of these like foibles because
yeah.
I'm practiced at it. So I had to show that, and I also had to show, wow, this is what life is, and I had forgotten I can experience things with my own eyes and my own heart and my own body, and I want to show what that looks like.
Yeah. So I'm going to finish with a weird thing that I'm going to say here and just throw it out as a thought for people who listen to this. We've all gone through a very intense time in the political year we've come through. It parallels COVID in a way. The last weeks before the election are a time out that's going to be dimly remembered because it was so intense. And that's whether you voted for Trump or for Kamala Harris, as I did. But we've had the COVID experience, and now we've had this intense political divisiveness and so on. I just want to recommend Laura's book as a way to do what she did when she traveled to Vienna and looked at the Kiss, reconnect with the reality of beauty out there. And Laura's book is a wonderful path to that, if I can put it that way. And I would like to make that the last thing I want to say. And then the last thing I want to say to you is, um, thank you for being with us, and stay on the line with my producer Ernie when we're done here, so that if someone else comes to mind, just like Melanie thought of you, if there's someone you think, oh gee, Frank ought to talk to this person or read this book or whatever it may be, pass on a name or two to Ernie. And then would you like to say anything that I haven't touched on? I'm sorry for jumping around your book this way, but I thought that was the way to do it because I wanted to talk about who you are and use the book as a springboard to find out things about you rather than just simply, talk about the book. So I hope that was okay with you.
No, that's great. Do I have parting words?
Yeah, I'm just saying, I mean, is there anything you want to say in terms of the book, or we're gonna put a link to it and do everything we can to promote it, but the context of your book, the context of this talk, the book came out a while ago, but it certainly is nothing that dates. It'll be, 100 years from now, it'll be just as good a read because of the insight into human relationships and your own vision of fulfilling your dad's unkept dreams or unlived dreams because of the fact he was killed. And again,
Yeah.
anything you want to add to that?
Well, we didn't talk about this distracted driving part a whole lot, and I think, there's a moment in the book where I recognize that I can be a role model.
Right.
I can be someone who shows people, hey, I'm doing these 54 fun things, but I'm not on my phone all the time. I'm
Right.
not, I might show you some pictures later on Instagram, but I'm not, while I'm doing it, because it's dangerous to do that. And
Yeah.
I think we're getting into a time where maybe there's going to be a little less of that. People want to reclaim like more, in-person interactions and just the visceral feeling of being in the world.
Yeah.
And I think as we move forward from the time that we're living in right now, it's so crucial that we flex that muscle,
Hmm.
our humanity, and see the humanity in others, and we're not quick to size someone up and be like, oh, you're this, that, or the other thing. Like we're all the same here. We're all just trying to like make our way in the
Yeah.
world, and we can help. We can choose to help. We can help each other.
Yeah.
I think that's what my father would say too.
Well, thank you again. And hold your book up one more time. Tell us the title one more time. I read mine on Kindle, but buy the book too. And it's Laura, why don't you just read us the title again?
My father's list, how living my dad's dreams set me free.
Okay, and I'll add, please subscribe right now on YouTube to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. Thank you so much, Laura, for being with us. Thanks again to Melanie for introducing us, and all the very best. Stay on a bit after I say goodbye here so you can talk to Ernie,
Okay,
Ernie
thank
Grave, my
you. It
producer.
was an honor to talk to you.
Well, honor is a big word, but it was certainly a pleasure on my part. You're lovely and your book's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.